I am Michael Erlewine, and welcome to Spirit Grooves, shows devoted to awareness of all kinds. This series of stories is about experiences I have had with learning meditation, and particularly what is called Mahamudra meditation. It's a bit of a personal story, but it's also a story of discovering the Dharma. But still, the total amount of actual practice time I was doing off the cushion easily added up to more than I had been able to practice at any other times in my day, including the time spent sitting on the cushion, which at that time for me had become a kind of joke. Every time I headed for the cushion, it seemed like I put on the robes of my expectation, of arrogance, embarrassment, of past failures, and certainly irritation. So the cushion was getting a much-needed rest. This new process of post-meditation practice was not something that I could measure in days or even months. In fact, it took about 2 years of this kind of exploration before I really had it down to any useful degree. But it was useful, and it actually worked, which translates to, perhaps for the first time in my many years of mind practice, I actually liked to practice. Something I had devoutly wished for all those years. If there was one thing I was ashamed of and feared all those years, it was that I could not find much joy in practicing. Practice is practice. I knew that this was not the way it should be or could be, but I was powerless to bring joy to something I could not find joy in. And it took the shock of an outside event to really push me totally into new territory. And here's my story. I had been working for the preceding 4 years or so as a senior consultant to a subsidiary of NBC, one that specialized in astrology, something I know quite a lot about, some 45, 50 years of experience. I was putting in long hours for them and for myself because I was building content, something that I'm well known for in my career as an archivist of popular culture. I had been the creator of the All Music Guide, allmusic.com, the All Movie Guide, allmovie.com, and other entertainment sites. It's not unusual for me to put in 12, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. I was getting up at 3 or 4 in the morning most days, concentrating on programming. And during that time, I'm creating thousands of tarot-like cards for astrology in Adobe Illustrator. I was writing courses and other text-related projects, and I took a lot of joy in that. All of these tasks were perfect to test out my Mahamudra practice, which was coming along really well. All it lacked was the motivation that comes with a worthy object. In other words, I was practicing Mahamudra while working on essentially mundane tasks instead of the quote-unquote Dharma itself. Although my intent and motivation for astrology were very pure and heartfelt. In late May of 2008, while attending an astrology conference in Denver, Colorado, along with 1,500 other astrologers, the head of the NBC outfit that I had been working for, who was also at the conference, told me that I no longer would have a job with them after June, like next month. In an attempt to pare down expenses, NBC laid off a lot of folks, and I happened to be one of them. Of course, this was a real shock to me, since I had been working so hard at it, and the financial ramifications simply meant that I would soon have no income whatsoever. At almost 67 years of age at the time, finding a job was probably not too easy, even though I had a lot of skills and experience, plus a good reputation. But it went beyond that for me. It was one of those corners life offers us that we somehow just have to get around. It turned out that I had to leave the astrology conference a few days early when I found out that His Holiness the 17th Karmapa was suddenly making his first visit to the United States and was going to come to his main seat in this country, Karma Triana Dharmachakra Monastery, KTD in short, in the mountains high above Woodstock, New York. Well, I could not miss that event, and as it turned out, I could be useful as part of a 3-man video team to film the event. And personally, I was able to film some other events where they didn't really want much of anyone present. I had been around KTD so long, so many years, that I was pretty much a kind of fixture there anyway. I would love to tell you about the visit of His Holiness, but that would be a whole nother story. But the gist of it was that seeing His Holiness was a big shot in the arm for me. I also took hundreds of still photos of the event, and after I got home, within a few weeks, I had made a 200-page coffee table-sized book of the visit of His Holiness, which I then made available to the close Sangha. The book was inspired not so much by me as a photographer as by the fact that all of the people I was photographing had just been with His Holiness, and they were shining with happiness, and they had a light that was clearly obvious in the photographs. The time with His Holiness certainly helped to put the fact that I no longer had a job into some kind of perspective. Still, to be suddenly without a paycheck is a shock, and it sure went through my system like a lightning. Where before I was working long hours at my job, suddenly I had all kinds of time on my hands, a really big gap of time in my life. Talk about popping out of what you were focused in, the so-called gap in Mahamudra practice. Well, this was a really shocking gap, and I popped out big time, and here's how I was able to actually look at that gap. I had been working as an entrepreneur without a break or gap for over 30 years straight. When you work for yourself, you don't have weekends and holidays, or at least you don't live for them. When you love your work, time off and vacations are meaningless, at least for me, or worse, boring. Anyway, that's how I always experience them. And now, with all of this time on my hands, my past interest in photography and recent photo work at KTD begin to come out, and this hobby plays an important role in the story. I had been deemed a photographer by my father, who was a really good photographer himself, ever since he had given me a little Kodak Retina 2A camera back in 1954, when I was something like 13, and he sent me on a 3,000-mile trip across the U.S. and Canada with a dip into Mexico on a bus with a bunch of kids my age. He explained to me before I left how to take good pictures, and I listened. Apparently, I had taken some great pictures because he couldn't say enough about them when I returned. Perhaps the only time he ever felt that way about anything I've done. The long and short of it is that I came away from that time with the sense that perhaps, and this was maybe only in my mind, that I had a really good eye for photography. And I'd been toying with photography for a number of years. Like many of us, I had, of course, taken the requisite shots of my family, our dogs, and whatnot. And as part of a large archival database that I was creating for documenting rock and roll posters, I had purchased a Nikon D1X system, $5,000, and carefully photographed some 23,000 plus posters. For this, I had built my own vacuum table, had an exact light set up, and so on. So I knew at least something about photography. But in the late spring of 2008, after falling out of a job, I found myself embracing photography more deeply. perhaps just as a way to find some stability from my somewhat chaotic life at the time. And then there was my interest in nature. Even though this happened only a year or so ago, I have trouble pinpointing just how I happened to start going out into nature again. You see, I was a trained naturalist and had intensely studied nature from the time I was about 6 years old until my late teens, and I mean intensely. In my early teens, I even was given a tiny honorary office space at the University of Michigan's museums building, just because I was somewhat precocious. I mean, I was really into it. Now, my wife loves nature, and for the last many years had done all she could to get me out in the woods, into the streams and the fields once again. But I had pretty much declined the invitation. I don't know why exactly. Perhaps it was because I felt that nature had been early on my real teacher, and I had learned my lessons. Certainly school had taught me almost nothing. Whatever life lessons I carried came from observing how nature behaved, and once learned, I was unwilling to open up that avenue again. Why would that be? Now that I think about it, here is probably the reason, and I'll use an analogy. My favorite female vocalist of all time is Billie Holiday. No other voice has moved me so utterly than she has. That being said, the fact is that I don't listen to Billie Holiday very often. In fact, hardly ever. And why? The reason is because I have to really prepare myself or work up to hearing her sing, because she puts me through so very much emotionally that I'm not always ready to just let that happen. I tell you this because it is the same with nature and her lessons. I studied natural history for so many years and with such diligence that there was not much I missed as to what goes on out there in the woods and meadows. I know every frog, salamander, and snake, not to mention insects and you name it. I not only know them, I know all about their lives and deaths. Nature is so absolutely candid and direct that she leaves almost nothing to the imagination. And nature does not know mercy. It's all laid out for anyone to see, and it's not a story without emotional affects. I did not need to become a Buddhist to love the life in every living creature. I had always felt that way. When I was confirmed in my early teens as part of Catholic ritual, my chosen confirmation name was Francis, after St. Francis of Assisi, the saint who loved and protected animals. That was me. I've often joked that I like animals better than people, and I wasn't being all that funny. It's kind of true. The Buddhists tell us that animals are bewildered. I feel great compassion for their bewildered state, and I'm working on the same feeling and feeling the same way toward human beings. So nature, like listening to Billie Holiday, was probably something I really had to work up to as far as re-immersion is concerned. It's just way too sensitive for words. Nature is beautiful, but nature is raw. Every last animal out there lives in constant fear. They are always looking over their shoulder for something bigger than they are that wants to eat them. And they are always looking for something smaller to eat. They have almost no rest their entire lives. This whole concept of impermanence and the fragility of life is everywhere present in nature. The countless tiny tadpoles that don't mature before the spring pond dries out, or the mass of worms and slugs that get caught on the tarmac as the fierce sun comes up over the horizon in the dawn and then dries them to a crisp, or the huge luna moth that's so heavy it can hardly fly, fluttering in the still morning light, trying to find a tree to hide in for the day as it's snapped up by the bird just when it tries to land, and so on. You get the idea. It is endless and merciless. This is not an isolated story, not the exception that proves the rule, but just the opposite. This is the rule without almost any exceptions ever. In nature, life is brief, fear-filled and accident-prone for almost all sentient life. And humankind is not really an exception, although we choose to ignore how samsara, our confused state, actually is. We are one of the very few beings that have any real control over destiny, and we never have as much control as we imagine. The rest of the animal world are simply bewildered, too stunned by their lack of real intelligence to protect themselves. And then we hunt them. I trust you get the idea that I'm painting. It's one of a nature that has no mercy, and death that is inexorable in its presence and swiftness. Is it any wonder that I had to cross over some kind of threshold to really want to take a closer look at nature once again? I already knew what nature is about. Anyway, I hope you get the point. But that year of 2008, back then, I was not in an ordinary frame of mind. I had just been shaken out of every sense of safe I knew, at least financially. I'd been put out, turned loose, and set free from any path or trajectory that I thought I was on. So it's no surprise that I easily crossed over that threshold, the threshold that I had avoided for so many years, and begin to re-immerse myself in the way things were in nature. I already was completely vulnerable and reminded personally how things can be when we have no control. I was certainly in the mood, and the camera was probably my ticket to ride, my excuse to get lost in nature once again. It was like finding my roots, like going home. Somehow it was consoling. I became absolutely fascinated with close-up camera work, what is called macro or micro photography. And for me, this meant close-up photography of nature and all the living things surrounding us. And in what was perhaps also a symbolic gesture, I got out of my office. For years I had been kind of afraid to leave my office lest I miss an important phone call or whatever next thing that I was waiting for. As mentioned, my wife tried just about everything to get me out of my stick-in-the-mud office, but to no avail. But now I just walked out and into the fields. It was dramatic. Each morning would find me out in the meadows and woods at sunrise, lugging my camera equipment around, and there in the mist and dew-covered fields I would be photographing all that was beautiful, or many times just sitting there in the grass as the first sun rays peeked over the trees, and simply doing nothing. In fact, here's a poem I wrote about that. It's called Time for Nothing. Excuse me for the moment, no matter the reasons why. I just need more time to do nothing but gaze into clear, empty sky. Now, I'm not talking about weekends. I watched almost every sunrise from around late May through October until it became just too cold to take my camera or myself outside for extended periods of time. Think about that just for a moment. I watched every sunrise for half a year, and this after seldom ever leaving my office for 30 or so years. My family was puzzled. As I look back on it now, it was, of course, a very remarkable time, and here I am remarking on it. But what was the most remarkable about this time was not at first apparent to me, and this is what I want to present here. The experience that I had accumulated over the preceding 3 years or so doing Mahamudra meditation practice on my computer had kind of extended itself to any time I did close, concentrated work. I'm very much at home with drudgery, at home in very concentrated and tedious work. I need only to point to the fact that I single-handedly, and then later with a staff of hundreds, recorded, reviewed, and documented every piece of recorded music from 10-inch records on up to the present. Similarly, we documented every single film and movie, complete with its entire cast and video, then on into video games and rock posters, and so on. You get the idea. I am obsessive. My personal collection of CDs, which I no longer own, now sits in a warehouse in Ann Arbor, Michigan, numbering well over 600,000 CDs and counting. My point is that I have a high tolerance for tedium, and nothing is more time-consuming and demanding of real concentration than computer programming and then video editing. That was before I encountered macro photography. And I don't know for sure why I got into macro and close-up photography as opposed to perhaps landscape photography or just walking in the woods, in the meadows, and taking pictures. But I have a guess. It could have been that looking through an open lens with real magnification at a tiny diorama, at a world that was ever so much obviously more perfect than the one I was in that moment, somehow was freeing to me. Every tiny fly and insect appeared so incredibly complete, so perfect in every respect at the micro level. The outer world that I knew just then, it did have beautiful patches, but it had rotten ones too, areas that were stained beyond appreciation. But here in this micro world, you could always find some little bit of perfection, perhaps a newly hatched dragonfly that was absolutely fresh in every way. And I particularly like dioramas, miniature scenes, the tiniest of landscapes. Anyway, I was transported by what I saw. I hope you have enjoyed this segment of Spirit Grooves. If you'd like to read further on awareness, please see my free ebooks on astrologyland.com. Look for the book link in the middle of the page. My name is Michael Erlewine, and I curate what is probably the largest library of astrology in the world, the Heart Center Library. I hope you have enjoyed this segment of Spirit Grooves, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.